In the last lecture, we saw that all organisms share certain characteristics. Among these traits, all organisms obtain and use energy. All organisms reproduce with variations. All organisms grow and develop, and all organisms respond to changes in their external environment. In lecture 44, we're going to find that all living things have to adopt a strategy to compete for resources and survive variations in the environment. This lecture is divided into two parts. First, I want to look at one more shared characteristic of all organisms, the metabolic process by which all organisms gain atoms and energy. Then I'm going to review the characteristics of the 5 great kingdoms of life: Monera, Protista, fungi, plants, and animals. Let's begin by looking at metabolism, which is the cell's process of obtaining energy from its surroundings and converting that energy into molecules. Recall from earlier lectures on thermodynamics that energy is the ability to do work. Work is a force acting over a distance. If life is to survive, if it's to grow, if it's to reproduce, if it's to escape its enemies, it needs energy. Energy is thus essential for every aspect of living things. Nothing happens without energy. So before looking at specific groups of organisms, it's important to consider this characteristic that's shared by all living organisms. That's the metabolic process that stores chemical energy. One of the real challenges facing all cells in every living thing is that you have to transfer energy from one part of the physical structure of the cell to other parts of the cell. Anytime you want to carry out a chemical reaction, you have to have energy available, and so you have to be able to move that chemical energy from one part of the cell to another part of the cell. The way life does this is remarkable. It uses several different kinds of small molecules, tiny molecules, that basically act like batteries. Energy-rich molecules that can move from one part of the cell and essentially plug in to larger molecules to facilitate these chemical reactions. The most common of these molecular batteries is called adenosine triphosphate, for short ATP. The important part, at least as far as the energy is concerned, is that triphosphate, or the TP part. Here you have 3 groups of phosphorus and oxygen, phosphates they're called, that are linked end to end, 1, 2, 3. And energy is released when you break a phosphorus-oxygen bond. The reaction is very simple. It's ATP, that is triphosphate, goes to ADP, diphosphate with 2 phosphates, plus an extra phosphate, an extra PO4 group, and it releases energy in the process. Now, this whole process is not at all unlike getting energy by breaking carbon-carbon bonds when you burn wood or coal or natural gas and so forth. Now, ATP molecules are formed in one part of the cell called mitochondria. And then they're shipped from the mitochondria to other parts, other places in the cell where they power that cellular machinery. And they really do act as batteries. You plug them into molecules. I want you to think of an analogy, for example, a staple gun. Now imagine a staple gun where you had to plug in a tiny battery, and each time you did, you could use the staple gun to staple 2 pieces of paper together. But then once you did that, the battery is exhausted. You had to pull out that battery, put in a new battery, and then the staple gun was ready to staple 2 more pieces of paper together. That's exactly how molecular batteries work. Each ATP molecule allows you to staple or put together 2 molecules, break apart 2 molecules, do some other cellular chemical function, and in the process, that ATP powers the molecule to do one operation at a time. So you need a lot of ATP in your cells. In fact, a typical cell will have millions upon millions of ATP molecules available at any one time. This is true for you and me. It's true for virtually all of the cells in our body. The 100 trillion cells in our body all have to have ATP to carry out these functions. Well, all but with a few exceptions, which we'll see when we talk about cells. Now, ATP molecules are synthesized in several different ways. One important process that occurs in all cells is called glycolysis. In glycolysis, An energy-rich molecule, a sugar molecule with 6 carbons, is split into 2 smaller fragments, each with 3 carbons. That 6-carbon sugar is called glucose, and you've probably heard of glucose solutions. This is energy-rich solutions. If you want a quick jolt of energy, you can eat a candy bar, and then you're getting concentrated sugar, concentrated glucose, or some other sugar that can be split to give you lots of energy in a very short time. The actual process of glycolysis is quite complex. There are 10 different chemical steps that must be undertaken. But the ultimate reaction, the net reaction, is that a glucose with 6 carbons breaks down to 2 pyruvic acid molecules, each with 3 carbons, plus 2 ATPs, 2 of those little batteries. The important role of phosphorus in glycolysis was discovered in 1905 by the British biochemists Arthur Harden and W.J. Young, who were studying the breakdown of glucose by yeast cells. Now think about it. ATP is adenosine triphosphate. You need to have phosphorus atoms to do this reaction, but nobody knew that at the time. And their story illustrates something about the serendipitous nature of science. What they found is that glucose breakdown slowed and stopped before all the glucose had been consumed. And this implied that for glycolysis to occur, you needed to have not only glucose, but something else, some other raw material. What could it be? What limited this reaction? Using trial and error methods, they added one chemical after another, and eventually they discovered that the addition of phosphorus got things going again. As long as you had a little bit of phosphorus available, the yeast could keep going through glycolysis. So this was the clue that phosphates play a key role in metabolism. Now there's several other metabolic pathways, including respiration and fermentation, and we'll talk about those. They both produce ATP, as well as other molecules that serve in the role of batteries. Recall that one of the products of glycolysis is that 3-carbon molecule called pyruvic acid. Pyruvic acid still holds lots of energy. As you might expect, then, life has developed ways of exploiting that energy. And the most efficient of these processes is called respiration, in which the glucose molecule is completely disassembled to make lots of ATP molecules. Respiration is always preceded by glycolysis, which splits the glucose molecule, and then you have pyruvic acid. The pyruvic acid then enters a metabolic cycle variously called the citric acid cycle, or sometimes the TCA cycle, or sometimes it's called the Krebs cycle, after the British biochemist Hans Krebs, who worked out the details in the 1930s. Throughout the several steps of the Krebs cycle, carbon-based molecules are oxidized, and they therefore produce CO2, carbon dioxide, plus energy, which ultimately gets taken up as the ATP and other energy-rich molecules. A single glucose molecule can be converted to as many as 38 ATP molecules. And in this process of respiration, here's the chemical reaction. You start with glucose. You make 6 CO2 molecules. You also make a bunch of H2O, or water molecules, plus energy. This looks like a very efficient reaction, but even so, the energy transfer is only about 40% of the chemical energy stored in glucose. In life, as in every other physical system, the second law of thermodynamics comes into play. You can never have a perfectly efficient system. For example, a system of respiration. Some of the energy is always lost in converting those chemical reactions. Fermentation, that's another form of gaining energy, another form of metabolism, and it's an incomplete reaction of pyruvic acid to alcohol or some other small carbon-based molecule in the absence of oxygen. So if you don't have oxygen around to oxidize things, you go through fermentation. Now you can tell the reaction is incomplete because if you ever had alcohol, a product of fermentation, you know you can burn it. And if you can burn it, you can get more energy out of it. So fermentation is incomplete. Indeed, this inefficient process yields only 2 ATP molecules per starting glucose. In the most familiar form of fermentation, you have yeast cells, and they convert sugar to pyruvic acid by glycolysis, and then on to ethyl alcohol, and ethyl alcohol is the alcohol of alcoholic beverages. Fermentation of fruits produce wine. Fermentation of grain produces beer. And if you allow the carbon dioxide to remain in the liquid, remember CO2 is always a byproduct, then you get a carbonated beverage such as beer or champagne. The absolute maximum alcohol content by fermentation alone is about 15% alcohol. So if you want stronger alcoholic beverages, you have to use distillation to get extra alcohol and add it to the beverage. Fermentation of a variety of other sorts occurs. For example, fermentation occurs in human muscle cells that are engaged in such strenuous activity as exercise. You use them over and over again, and you exhaust the supply of oxygen. So then you go to fermentation, and the end product of fermentation is lactic acid. That's a 3-carbon molecule, and it causes that aching feeling in tired muscles when it concentrates in the muscles. There are other organisms that produce a variety of commercially useful products by fermentation. For example, lactic acid, that's the commonest byproduct of fermentation. It gives yogurt and rye bread and some cheeses their rather sour taste. The bacteria that makes Swiss cheese is another example. It forms the 3-carbon propionic acid, which gives Swiss cheese its distinctive flavor. And you might note the big holes in Swiss cheese are where the carbon dioxide comes out and forms large bubbles. Vinegar is another example. Vinegar comes from the fermentation of apples or grapes by an acetic acid-producing bacteria. So you see how important fermentation is in a variety of ways. Now remember, all these products are just incidental. They're byproducts from the actual vital process of making energy. Well, let's shift gears and turn our attention to the strategies of different kinds of organisms. So this is the second part of our lecture. And let's look first at the one-celled organisms, which might seem to be the simplest group in terms of survival strategies, but actually it turns out they're by far the most diverse. Single-celled organisms live under many different extreme conditions and have developed a huge variety of metabolic strategies to gain energy to survive. We find single-celled organisms anywhere there's liquid water, under the Arctic ice, near boiling point in hot springs. We find them in salt lakes. We find them deep underground in solid rock where there's only a small amount of water circulating through very, very gradually. We find single-celled organisms also in the deepest part of the ocean in places where hot volcanic waters are circulating through rocks. Microbes, then, are incredibly diverse in their ability to survive almost any kind of water-rich environment. Microbes get their energy from an equally wide variety of sources. Some microbes are photosynthetic. They obtain light from the sun. And many microbes consume biomolecules from other living things. Almost like animals, they bring in molecules with which to build their structures, with which to get energy. But there are a host of microbes that get energy from the oxidation or the reduction of rocks. In effect, these microbes eat rocks. They live on rock surfaces. Some examples. There are bacteria that oxidize hydrogen to make water. They can oxidize iron to make iron oxides, oxidize methane to make CO2 plus water, or they can oxidize sulfur compounds to make a whole variety of horrible smelling things. And you may have smelled sulfur eating bacteria at one time or another in your life. All of these types of bacteria transfer electrons to oxygen in the process of oxidation. But many microbes use the opposite strategy. They survive by reducing compounds. They reduce iron oxides or sulfur or carbon or other compounds. And in this case, electrons are transferred from the oxygen to other groups of atoms. You see, any time that you can get energy, either by moving an electron to or from oxygen or any other pair of atoms, you're going to find a microbe that's likely to exploit that pathway. Now, most microbes live as isolated single cells, but some have developed the ability to organize into amazing colonies, into structures, for example, slime mold, where you actually can have three-dimensional structures of stalks and spikes and so forth, that somehow these individual bacteria are communicating in a colonial sort of way that we don't exactly understand. Well, on to the next kingdom, the kingdom of fungi. This includes mold, it includes mushrooms, yeast, all kinds of organisms that in some ways resemble plants in terms of their cell structure and their growth patterns, but they're non-photosynthetic. Fungi adopt a remarkable variety of strategies to survive. Some fungi, like yeast, They're single-celled organisms. They form bacteria-like colonies. They reproduce primarily asexually by the production of spores by normal cell division. Other fungi, including the molds, consist of myriad intertwined filaments. These grow as fluffy masses. Mold begins as single-celled spores that can travel easily through the air, but when they land on a food source, these filaments start growing cell by cell, just adding cells onto the end of each filament, and they get longer and longer. We have lichens. Lichens have a remarkable cooperative lifestyle. They include fungi filaments that are intertwined with photosynthetic algae. So you have single-celled organisms living with the fungi. The fungi provide an essential minerals and also a protective anchored habitat with those filaments. The algae provide an energy source for the fungi. So there's a symbiosis between the two types. So when you see a lichen, you're actually seeing two species or more that are intertwined with each other. Mushrooms. They're the only type of fungi that rely primarily on sexual reproduction. They consist of innumerable filaments that are completely intertwined with each other and form that mass, the solid mass of the mushroom. That distinctive umbrella shape of many mushrooms and the textured undersides of the mushroom caps, they facilitate the release, the transfer, and the spread of spores. Fungi may seem simple and insignificant, perhaps not worthy of much serious notice, but they play many important roles in nature. For example, they help to decompose dead organisms. They convert rocks into soils. Through the process of fermentation, fungi facilitate the production of cheese, of soy sauce, of alcoholic beverages, many of the things we consume. And of course, many mushrooms are edible and a part of people's diets. Fungi assist in the manufacture of many industrial products as well, including soaps and plastics and so forth. And then there's penicillin and the antibiotics developed from fungi. Penicillin has saved countless lives, and the discovery of penicillin is a fascinating example of a chance discovery. It was the British bacteriologist Sir Alexander Fleming. He was growing cultures of the often dangerous bacterium Staphylococcus in his laboratory, and he grew these in dishes with a nutrient, sort of set them out and let the bacterium grow. But he noticed that one of the dishes that he'd been working with was contaminated by the common mold Penicillium. Now, while other scientists must have seen the same effect, noticed that their bacteria no longer grew when Penicillium infected the slide, they just threw those dishes away, saying, oh, that's a lousy experiment, I'll have to start over. And it must have been an annoyance. But Fleming realized that the mold must be producing a chemical that actually kills off bacteria, and he said, that could be an important discovery. So shortly thereafter, methods were developed to manufacture large quantities of this chemical substance called penicillin, and the drug was put into mass production in 1943. That was in time to save countless thousands of lives during World War II, and of course subsequently with the widespread adoption of these antibacterial agents. Now plants. The great kingdom of plants and algae obtain their energy from the light of the sun, converting photons to chemical energy by the process of photosynthesis. All plants and algae use this process by which solar energy is converted into energy-rich molecules such as the sugar glucose. The raw materials of photosynthesis are nothing more than water and carbon dioxide, fed by the sun's radiant energy. So the net reaction to form glucose is simply 6 CO2 molecules plus 6 water molecules plus photons, light energy from the sun, produce glucose. That's C6H12O6, the sugar molecule, and 3 oxygen molecules, 3 O2 molecules, which then go off into the atmosphere. Well, this is not at all intuitive chemistry. You're taking CO2 from the air, water from the ground or the air, and you're converting it into a sugar, a big organic molecule of sugar with energy, plus oxygen atoms which go into the atmosphere, this highly reactive gas being emitted into the air. Now, most observers assume that the materials needed to make wood and leaves, fruit, seeds, and so forth came from the soil, because you're making solids. They thought solid matter had to come from the soil. The experiment that tested this hypothesis was made by the Flemish physician Johannes Baptista von Helmont, who lived from 1579 to 1644. He performed a simple and elegant experiment, a dramatic experiment, to demonstrate how plants obtained raw materials. And you can reproduce this experiment yourself if you'd like. Here's what he did. Von Helmont planted a 5-pound willow tree, a young willow tree, in a pot containing 200 pounds of soil. He watered that tree for 5 years, during which time it grew to be 169 pounds. So you're going to need 5 years to do this experiment, by the way, if you want to do it, but it might be worth trying. He also carefully weighed the soil. And the soil, he found, lost less than a pound. Here's this 169-pound tree. The soil lost less than a pound. So almost all the tree's mass, he assumed, had to come from air and water. And indeed, that's what we now know. Air, CO2, and water gives the solid mass of the tree. Well, Earth's surface displays a staggering variety of plants, from delicate moss to giant redwoods, flowers and ferns, grains, grasses of all sorts. The classification of plants is thus very difficult and not at all a matter of universal consensus. The algae are especially problematic because they can thrive as single-celled organisms, but then they often form large colonies with plant-like structures, such as kelp and seaweed, which you've seen. So is that a plant? Is it a single-celled organism? It's sort of arbitrary how you define it. Nature does what nature does, and our definitions and our classifications are not necessarily restricting nature to what it's going to do. So many scientists classify some kinds of algae as plants, some kind as monera, or single-celled organisms. The main divisions of multicellular plants, most of which live on land, are based on the way they reproduce and also how they circulate water throughout their vascular systems. The simplest plants are bryophytes, including mosses, and they absorb their moisture directly through above-ground structures. So because you're absorbing water through above-ground structures, you have to live in very wet areas and right near the ground. You can't grow very tall. Most other plants are vascular plants. They have root systems and stems. They have leaves. They have an internal plumbing system that moves water by capillary action. There are 3 big groups of vascular plants that do this. They're the ferns, which have spores. They're the gymnosperms, such as evergreens, that have seeds but no flowers. And finally, the angiosperms, with seeds and flowers. All plants reproduce sexually, but they can also be cloned. That is, you can take genetically identical plants just by growing them from a single cell or small pieces of an older plant. And then finally we come to animals. Animals include multicellular organisms that obtain their energy and raw materials from the biomolecules of other organisms. They eat other organisms. Animals are remarkable for their diversity. There are more than 1.3 million living species of animals that are known. So that's about 2/3 of all known species. And then there are numerous extinct ones from the fossil record as well. Although some aspects of animal classification are under debate, there are about 30 to 35 distinct phyla, each of which represents a basic design, a different structural design for organisms. And let's just look at a few of these. We have the vertebrates, of course, our own group. They include all the animals with a bony skeleton and a backbone that protects a spinal cord. There are about 40,000 known living species of vertebrates, and those vertebrates are divided into 7 different classes. Things like fishes, which include the familiar ray-finned fishes, and the earliest vertebrate fossils, which are also fish with bony armored plates. We have then amphibians, the first land vertebrates. These include frogs and salamanders. These animals have a moist, permeable skin, so they have to remain near a wet environment. All amphibians do. Modern reptiles include lizards, snakes, turtles, alligators, crocodiles. They're among the few survivors from the great age of reptiles, which was about 245 to 65 million years ago, the age when dinosaurs flourished. They have thick, scaly skin, and this skin resists dehydration. So reptiles have been able to adapt to many different land environments. We have about 9,000 species of modern birds. These appear to be direct descendants of the dinosaurs, and they're distinguished by their feathers. Feathers give the birds the ability to fly. They also help the birds to regulate their internal body temperature, which is typically about 106 degrees Fahrenheit. And finally, we come to mammals, now represented by about 4,500 known species, though that number appears to have been declining at an alarming rate. During the last 10,000 years or so, it seems like many of the larger mammal species have gone extinct. And I'll talk more about that in lecture 59 when we look at the human effects on ecosystems. Mammals have two distinctive characteristics. They have hair, and they have the ability to suckle their young. But vertebrates are just a blip on the screen of the number of species. The vast majority of animal species are invertebrates, which include all the animals without backbone. And there are many different phyla. I'll just talk about a few of them. The simplest invertebrates are in the phylum of sponges, or porifera, which are aggregates of individual cells. You can take a sponge, you can grind it up, you can pass it through a sieve, and those cells will reorganize themselves to form another sponge. There are perhaps 10,000 living species, as well as numerous fossil species that extend back more than 500 million years in the fossil record. There's another phylum that contains jellyfish, corals, sea anemones, and other marine creatures that are radially symmetric. All of these in this phylum have a 3-layer bodied structure with a wall surrounding a stomach-like chamber. Here, as in all phyla, it's the structure, not the size or shape, that establishes the common lineage. So a 3-layer skin structure and the central stomach is sufficient to define this group. There are several phyla that contain different kinds of worms. There are flatworms and roundworms and segmented worms and others. All of these have similar external shapes, but they have different internal structures, and so they form different phyla. Mollusks. Mollusks is a phylum with 100,000 different species. It's the second largest of all the phyla. It includes gastropods, things like snails, bivalves, like clams, cephalopods, including the squids and the octopi. At several times in Earth's history, mollusks have absolutely dominated the oceans. They have hard shells, and they have worldwide abundance. They evolve very, very rapidly. And so mollusks provide wonderful markers for geological history. If you find a stratum of sediments and it has fossils of mollusks in it, the chances are you can date that layer of sediment very accurately because the mollusks have evolved so rapidly. By the way, lest you think that mollusks are lesser animals, octopuses are amazingly intelligent. An octopus in one tank can watch an octopus in an adjacent tank learn how to manipulate dials or find food, and then the first octopus learns just by watching the second octopus, can learn the same behavior. It's amazing. That's a very high level of intelligence. Then we come at last to arthropods. Arthropods number almost 1 million known species, and certainly the vast majority of arthropod species are unknown at this point. Many more are being found all the time. This huge phylum includes all the invertebrates with jointed legs. And there are 4 large groups of arthropods. We have the crustaceans, the lobsters and the crabs. We have insects, which have 3 body segments and 6 legs. There are chelicerates, things like spiders, scorpions, horseshoe crabs, which have 2 main body segments. And finally, myriapoda, things like millipedes and centipedes with lots of segments and lots of legs. Insects account for 70% of all the arthropods. Indeed, most of the known species are insects, and beetles represent the vast majority of those. When the distinguished evolutionary biologist J.B.S. Haldane, who lived from 1892 to 1964, was asked near the end of his life what his decades of study had taught him about God, he replied, "God has an inordinate fondness for beetles." Well, in summary, this lecture, we've seen how all organisms use the same basic metabolism for distributing energy throughout the cells. The strategy is to synthesize large numbers of small, energy-rich molecules like ATP that act as tiny batteries. Different kingdoms of life, however, have developed different strategies for obtaining energy. We have single-celled Monera and Protista. They exploit a variety of oxidation-reduction reactions. Some can even eat rocks. We have fungi that obtain energy from the decaying remains of other organisms. Plants obtain energy through photosynthesis of sunlight. and animals obtain energy by eating other organisms. In the next lecture, we'll begin to look in detail at the carbon-based molecules of life.